The coronavirus is a worldwide pandemic, but not the first outbreak that Massachusetts has dealt with in its history. This state has gone through many of them in the past. And as we wait and wait and wait to get to the other side of this, I found it sort of comforting knowing that Massachusetts has made it through awful bouts with smallpox, yellow fever, the flu, and more, and still managed to become the base state that we love. So let's take a look at some of the biggest outbreaks we've seen. In 1616, a horrible plague tore through the Native American population that historians believe originated from European ships. It's the first recorded epidemic in Massachusetts and actually hit before the English settled in the area, but the actual identity of the disease remains unanswered. This epidemic devastated tribes across the region and nearly wiped out entire tribes in the state, according to the National Library of Medicine. Smallpox also killed 20 settlers from the Mayflower, including their only physician, in 1633. Smallpox continued to be a problem in colonial Massachusetts, infecting people every few years. In 1721, smallpox infected more than half of the city of Boston and led to the deaths of about 850 people. We don't really see smallpox nowadays, thanks to vaccines, but it brought victims flu-like symptoms and rashes that turned into pustules. Ugh, sounds awful. We actually have a first-hand account from Boston's Puritan minister Cotton Mather, who observed the beginnings of the outbreak in 1713. The virus killed many of his own family, just like it did to many others in the area, and these diary entries show a first-hand account of how it struck his family. In my poor family, now first my wife has the measles appearing on her. My daughter Nancy is also full of them. My daughter Lizzie is likewise full of them. Help, Lord, and look mercifully on my poor, sad, sinful family. By the end of November, he had lost his wife, 3 children, and his servant, 5 out of the 11 people infected in his family. Mather discovered that inoculation might be a way to prevent smallpox thanks to a man he enslaved. His name was Onesimus, and he told Mather that he had been inoculated from the virus in Africa. He had undergone an operation, which had given him something of the smallpox and would forever preserve him from it. He described the operation to me and showed me in his arm the scar which it had left upon him. Mather fought for the public use of inoculations and found many opponents to that idea, but it soon caught on in Boston. The first actual vaccine for smallpox was developed by the end of the century, and the disease was eradicated worldwide in 1980. Yes! Science! By the way, Onesimus' role in the history of vaccines wasn't well known until recent years. A doctor told the Massachusetts Medical Society in 1932 that the idea of inoculation came from Cotton Mather and from Cotton Mather only. You can hear more about that story on our website, nbc10boston.com. Now, this next epidemic did the most damage in New Hampshire and Maine, but also made its way to Massachusetts. Throat distemper, which is now thought to have been diphtheria, appeared in the spring of 1735 and killed 5,000 people across New England over the next 5 years, over 75% of them being children. The disease infects the respiratory system and creates a thick coating in the respiratory tract. It was first reported in New Hampshire, where 75 out of every 1,000 people infected died from it. Raleigh, Massachusetts lost about 200 people, 1/8 of its population, to the throat distemper, and nearby Byfield would see over 100 deaths, about 1/7 of its population at the time, according to the New England Historical Society. Diphtheria can be treated with antibiotics, which of course weren't around back then, and it's been almost entirely wiped out in the US now that we have a vaccine against it. It's one of the diseases prevented by the Tdap vaccines that doctors recommend for almost all kids. Quarantines aren't actually a modern idea. In 1648, the city of Boston required all ships arriving from the West Indies to quarantine. That's because slave ships were bringing yellow fever over from West Africa, and Massachusetts saw sporadic outbreaks of yellow fever over the years. Yellow fever is a nasty disease that comes from a virus spread by mosquito bites. Serious cases can lead to organ failure and death. But it's not a major worry in America anymore thanks to, you guessed it, vaccines. Before antibiotics were a thing, scarlet fever was a serious risk for children and spread across Massachusetts in a big way in 1858. Scarlet fever develops alongside strep throat and brings with it sore throat, rashes, and a high fever. In 1 year, scarlet fever killed over 2,000 people in Massachusetts, most of them under 16 years old. Finally, influenza, the flu, the viral infection that hits the lungs hard, very similar to the coronavirus, although the infectiousness and the mortality rate differ between the two viruses. America has had a long history of flu outbreaks, and Massachusetts has weathered many. There was a severe outbreak in the region in 1647, another that lasted a year in 1697, and several epidemics in the following centuries. The worst came in 1918, when 2 sailors came down with a strain of the flu while housed in Boston. In 1 week, there were 100 new cases, and over the next 6 months, more than 25 million Americans came down with the illness. The 1918 pandemic, which is commonly called the Spanish flu, but which actually probably originated in Kansas, would go down as one of the deadliest outbreaks in human history, with over 675,000 lives lost to it in America alone that year, and millions of people around the globe. It wasn't pretty. Along with serious flu symptoms, some suffering from this strain of influenza experienced blood spurting from the nose, eyes, and ears. In Massachusetts, over 50,000 people were infected within a month. Children in Boston had a dark little rhyme they sang while doing a little jump rope. I had a little bird, its name was Enza. I opened the window and influenza. Nursery rhymes, making light of catastrophic global events and what memes were before the internet. We all know that history repeats itself, and many of the debates we see today, like reopening schools, wearing masks, were seen during this horrific flu outbreak. Though, just a reminder, the flu and the coronavirus spread differently. The director of medical inspection in Boston Public Schools, William H. Devine, argued against closing down schools the month the outbreak began.
The children are actually better off in school than at home. They are inspected every day by physicians and nurses, and any suspicious case is immediately sent home with orders to remain in bed until a diagnosis has been made. There was nothing alarming in the situation.
And he was wrong. Boston Health Commissioner William Woodward was also wrong when he told people not to worry. The conditions won't improve through worry. On the contrary, they're likely to become worse. Yeah, he changed his tune once the outbreak passed, and continuing the trend of creepy nursery rhymes about viruses, published this little ditty. Mary had a little cold that started in her head, and everywhere that Mary went, that cold was sure to spread. It followed her to school one day, there wasn't any rule. It made the children cough and sneeze to have that cold in school. Ugh. I'll stick with the itsy bitsy spider with my toddler, less informative, but also a little less alarming. So outbreaks are nothing new, and while many have unfortunately lost their lives, we have persevered and used medical science to combat them. Right now we have COVID vaccines rolling out at a lightning pace and cases dropping for the most part across the country. There seems to be a light at the end of the tunnel. This may not be the last outbreak we deal with, but with the ever-evolving tools and knowledge, we can hopefully avoid the worst of it in the future.